Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on the latest NITC-funded research, the effects of ride-hailing on parking demand and revenues. I'm Lisa Patterson and will be your moderator for today. I'm the Tech Transfer and Workforce Development Program Manager for TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University. TREC leads the federally funded University Transportation Center, NITC, the National Institute for Transportation and Communities. NITC is one of 7 national centers across the U.S., and our research focuses on improving mobility for people and goods to build strong communities. This Portland State-led partnership includes the University of Oregon, Oregon Institute of Technology, University of Utah, University of Arizona, and University of Texas at Arlington. Our webinars are based on original research conducted by faculty, researchers, and students at these NITC partner universities. Our goal for these webinars is to get useful research results into the hands of practitioners, academics, and other stakeholders like yourselves. All right, our speakers today are Anne Brown and Benjamin Clark with the University of Oregon. Anne Brown is an assistant professor in the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management. Her research examines the intersection of equity, shared and innovative mobility, travel behavior, and transportation finance. Anne's dissertation research investigated the planning and equity implications of ride-hail services, including Lyft, Uber, and taxis. Current work analyzes the association between ride-hail use and parking occupancy and the equity implications of automated fare payments. Anne holds a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning and a PhD in Urban Planning from UCLA. Benjamin Clark specializes in municipal government management. His research examines how technology can be used to improve city management with smart city technology and how cities need to be planning financially and managerially for future innovations such as autonomous vehicles. In 2018, he helped to create the Oregon Policy Lab, a collaboration between the government of Lane County and the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management, geared toward providing technical assistance to the government and educational opportunities for students. All right, before diving into the webinar, I'd like to give you some updates on some of our upcoming events. This Friday, Sean Williams, PhD student, or I apologize, rather August 16th, next Friday, Sean Williams, PhD student at Brighton University, will be speaking at our Friday transportation seminar on the datafication of cycling, effects and opportunities at the intersection of industry and transport policy. You can join us in person or watch online. Our next webinar will be October 8th with Dr. Chris Monsier and Nathan McNeil from Portland State University. They'll be presenting on contextual guidance at intersections for protected bike lanes. And to see a full schedule of our upcoming events, you can visit trek.pdx.edu/events. All right. Also, we have our annual Transportation and Communities event coming up on September 19th and 20th. This event connects our nationally mobility-focused research with local practice through breakout panels, lightning talks, posters, and a keynote. Our keynote speaker this year will be Ben Wellington, a data scientist and policy analyst from New York. Day 2 will feature half-day workshops for a deeper dive into skill building. You can register at tcs2019.sketch.com. All right, and lastly, before I hand it over to our presenters, I'll give you a brief overview of the webinar. Anne and Benjamin will be presenting for about 40 minutes. During this time, you can submit questions, which will be answered at the end of the webinar. We will be recording today's webinar and we'll make it available on our website. And you'll also receive the video recording and presentation slides in an email following the webinar in the next day or 2. If you're tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. Instructions on how to redeem the credit will also be included in your post-webinar email. During the presentation, you can use the questions pane shown here to ask questions. We will track these questions and the presenters will respond to them at the end of the webinar. All right, and with that, I will hand the presentation over to Anne and Benjamin.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. This is Anne Brown. I'm going to be kicking off our webinar, and then I'm going to hand over the reins to Ben. I'm going to get us set up with our presentation, the effects of ride-hailing on parking demand and revenue, the case of Seattle. And I'm going to go through some of the context and then also research questions, data, and methods before Ben dives into the meat of our research, which is the findings and, of course, the implications for planning and practice. So first, before we get started off, we want to thank again the National Institute for Transportation and Communities and Urbanism Next at the University of Oregon for funding this research. And the context of this study, as you all know, Uber and Lyft have hit the scene back in 2012, and the growth since their initial arrival in cities has been basically exponential. And so cities are thinking now and grappling with how to plan for and adapt to cities, to these new modes and a variety of transportation and technology-enabled transportation in cities. So as of 2017, about 1 in 10 American adults took an Uber or Lyft in any given month, and we're seeing millions of both trips and vehicle miles traveled in cities and on our streets. So the question for cities, there's many of them related to Uber and Lyft, and we're diving into one of them today. The other reason to study Uber and Lyft in this time is that a lot of cities are also questioning the future beyond Uber and Lyft, so that's autonomous vehicles. And so often Uber and Lyft are seen as essentially a harbinger for the next wave of transportation innovation and specifically autonomous vehicles. So thinking about both the implications for Uber and Lyft now, Uber and Lyft or any other ride-hail services going forward, and then eventually autonomous vehicles. So as an example from the city of Seattle, which of course we'll be talking about today, which is the rapid growth of transportation network companies, specifically here is Uber and Lyft. And so in both these graphs, you can see the median increase and the mean increase in the growth of Uber and Lyft in the city of Seattle between 2012 and 2016. And so Uber and Lyft first arrived, 2012 was the first full year of operations. And you can see that in 2012, the number of TNC trips in the city of Seattle grew by about 35%. Every year, each month. By 2016, the growth wasn't as fast, but it's still about 4% each month growth. So we're growth. It is not as fast as, of course, that initial bump, but point being, there's not an end in the growth yet in sight. So as I mentioned previously, one of the questions for cities now is what happens both with Uber and Lyft and policy today, and then what should we be planning for going forward, and especially thinking about autonomous vehicles. So some recent research about city planning for autonomous vehicles found that most cities are not yet preparing for the arrival of autonomous vehicles. And so by studying Uber and Lyft now, that can hopefully prepare us for their eventual arrival. And of course, the topic for today and one of the biggest implications for Uber, Lyft, and eventually autonomous vehicles is parking. And so parking is both one of the biggest land uses in cities and as well a big financial asset and also potential liability for cities. So not only does parking consume street space, land use, but cities have sunk millions of dollars into this infrastructure. And one of our questions really is, what are the implications for this asset and this parking supply if it is used differently with the advent of autonomous vehicles and the presence of Uber and Lyft in our cities? And so, of course, Uber and Lyft and eventually autonomous vehicles really change the relationship between driving and parking. So traditionally, of course, parking was required at the beginning and end of every trip, of every car trip. Now with TNCs and eventually autonomous vehicles, that same parking demand is not necessarily guaranteed. So there's not the required nexus between a car trip and a parking space. And so one of the questions really is thinking about, what does this mean for the parking supplies? So how is parking occupancy changing? And then what are the implications for revenue? So already there's been some anecdotal but pretty sparse evidence from select locations. These are typically places like airports, busy nightlife districts. A lot of it's in the popular media looking at and recording decreasing parking occupancy over time. But really to date, there hasn't been a systematic evaluation of parking occupancy or revenue. And this is particularly critical as, again, as I mentioned, cities have invested millions of dollars into their parking infrastructure. Often these are being paid back through municipal bonds over time, and they're being paid back with parking revenue. And so the question of if parking becomes really a financial liability is an important one if, for example, parking occupancy plummets, revenues plummet, and then how do cities are on the hook essentially for paying for this very expensive infrastructure without really the demand for it. So this is a lot of the motivation. There's a lot of uncertainty, but also potential around parking in this new age of transportation. So the specific question that we are asking and answering in this research is, what is the link between the number of ride-hail trips in a neighborhood and parking revenue, specifically looking at the city of Seattle? So I'm going to give you a little more context and methods, so you know how we answered this question before Ben dives into the results and implications. So I mentioned that we did this research in the city of Seattle, and specifically looking at the parking districts within the city. So this map shows the 33 districts across the city of Seattle. Most are concentrated in the downtown area. And these are all the districts that have on-street parking operated by the city. An important piece here is partly that we have the data then for parking occupancy, parking price, and over time. So how do we measure transportation network company trips and parking revenue? In this research, we have data from 2013 to 2016. We have both the number of pickups and drop-offs for Uber and Lyft by neighborhood. So for example, every census tract has the total number of pickups and drop-offs conducted during a certain time period. And then from the city of Seattle, we have parking revenue, occupancy, and the average cost of that parking per hour. What else do we measure? We control for a number of factors. We want to know what's the context in which we're observing the changes in both ride-hail trips and parking revenues. So we control for a number of neighborhood characteristics, including the number of motor vehicles registered in that neighborhood, the number of parking spaces, the number of beer, wine selling establishments. And that comes from survey research of ride-hail users who state that they tend to use ride-hailing for social or recreational purposes. We also control for median household income, population density, and because over time the cost of gallon per gas has been linked to driving patterns, we control also for the average cost per gallon of gas. The unit of analysis is a bit unique in this study, and that's largely due to the size of the data we're working with. So the unit of analysis is the census tract in Seattle with paid on-street parking. So there's 33 census tracts in total. The time, we've broken down the unit of analysis by time and day of week. And the primary reason for that is the data from the city of Seattle, especially the parking data, is so detailed that ends up being about 500 gigabytes of data. So for our own data crunching ability, even on a supercomputer, we had to aggregate and collapse that down, also to improve the interpretability of the results. And so we've collapsed the data into 3 different times of day, so morning, midday, and evening, and then also by day of the week in a single month in a given year. What does that mean? It basically means that the results will be, all the data are collapsed, for example, into Monday mornings in January 2015 for a particular tract. So again, all single days of the week for a given month and year, and 3 time periods. In total, because we have so many different time periods, census tracts, and years, we have about 25,000 observations total to work with. I'm going to turn it over to Ben to review the results.
All right, thank you, Anne. Yeah, so again, as I'm talking about these results, try and think a little bit about what Anne was talking about in terms of like what our unit of analysis is, but don't get too hung up on the actual dollar amounts just because it's a little quirky in terms of that unit of analysis. So instead of boring you with a regression result table, I just wanted to primarily show you a few graphs that illustrate some of our primary findings. So in this first graph, what we're looking at is the total revenue generated in a time period. So we got, up in the top left corner, you have mornings. Next to that is afternoons, evenings, and then the one in the bottom right corner shows everything together. Now there are a few lines on here I wanted to kind of just point out. That solid vertical line is our mean value for 2016, and then the dashed vertical line is our maximum observed value for that. So what does this mean in terms of what we're seeing? So let's just look, for example, at that top left corner results. So on our x-axis there is the number of TNC trips, Uber and Lyft trips, and then we see on the y-axis the amount of revenue generated. So primarily what we're seeing in the data, that vertical, where that vertical solid line is what's happening today on average, or at least what was happening in 2016. We'd certainly expect that line to move further to the right today. But what it shows us today is that, well, revenue is still increasing with the number of TNC trips. So if you're somebody who's a parking planner, a street planner, that sort of thing, or a budget officer, you're like, well, I don't really need to worry about this today. Okay, but you need to be worried about where the trajectory of that line goes. So we see that maximum observed value line. Already at that point, we're about at the place where things are starting to level off in terms of revenue, and then shortly thereafter, they're going to start declining. And so each time of day has a different sort of curve to it and a different kind of pattern, because people use Uber and Lyft differently depending on the different time of day. And the rates that are charged also can change depending on the time of day as well throughout the city. So at our mean value, what we see is an average revenue generating over our time period about $5,573, right? But that doesn't mean much, again, given the context of our dependent variable or unit of analysis. So if we look at the maximum observed value, what we're seeing is that we're already seeing about 4% less revenue if we were at that maximum observed value than at the mean value today, right? So we're already seeing the potential with the ride amounts that we're having that revenue could start to decline. If we go out to 30,000 trips, which is about twice of that maximum value, we see even larger decline in revenue compared to what it would be on average at the end of our study here, by about 62%. So that's pretty substantial, and that should start to make our budget folks and our other planning folks start to worry about the revenue implications of TNCs. Now, this is not the reality of today, and this is also under the context of no policy change at all, and so that it needs to be taken into context. So we would predict, based on our model right now, that revenue would peak at about 5.3 times the 2016 average of ridership, right? So we're still a ways away from that. But again, what our models are showing is that even though we're still a ways away from hitting that point where revenue will start to decline, is that we need to start thinking about how to change policy to adjust to that. We have also looked at this revenue question from the perspective of how much revenue each parking space is generating on average, thinking that different inventories of parking spaces within a neighborhood may be different than the total revenue generating capacity. And so this is a slightly less dramatic looking curve. Most of them are kind of flat, but they still do have some potential tendency to decline as well. And the lines match up the same here with the maximum observed and the mean values There's a little bit more uncertainty in our models here than there was in the overall revenue. But what we still are seeing overall is that revenue is not going to continue to go up, again, given current levels of policy, rates and occupancy levels that the city is trying to achieve. And so again, we can see the mean per space would be about $1,400. The maximum observed value there, we're generating about 21% more in revenue. But then if we, more than, double the total number of trips that we have, that increase in revenue is only up 19% rather than that 21%. So you're starting to see how each space could potentially start to lose some income over time. And again, might want to have our planners start to think a little bit differently about rates or the size of that inventory that we have for parking. Another thing to really consider in this is that each neighborhood has a different profile in terms of the types of ride-hailing use, and therefore we also need to think about, how that might differ in terms of the revenue that's generated and the decline we might see in that revenue. So each one of these little graphics, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on them, but you can get the idea from looking at this that each one of these neighborhoods that we study in here has a different relationship with the amount of revenue that it's generating based on the number of trips that are happening, and each one of them is going to be affected a little bit differently. And so as policy is set and rates are set and thinking about what we need to do in each one of these neighborhoods, there may need to be a different approach taken in the Uptown Triangle versus South Lake Union versus Ballard versus Chinatown and Cherry Hill, so on and so forth. Another question that we looked at in here is how occupancy was affecting revenue. And it's probably a little bit difficult to parse out in all of these lines because they kind of tend to group over one another. But that regardless of the level of trips, the relationship tends to sort of hold pretty constant. But that revenue, that bottom line, the lowest line that you see there is actually the highest number of trips I modeled in this particular graphic, is that revenue is expected to be lower the higher the level of TNC trips that are taken. So what's next? Yes, that's a big question, and we're not going to get to all the answers of that today, but we'll try and capture a little bit of that. So I would say that in the near future, right, and that TNC use should be expected to increase, right? And that we probably won't see revenues falling, in the next couple of years. Though, again, there is evidence from airports, as Ann mentioned, and some other particular cases where revenue is already being seen being eaten away because of TNC trips. And so there may be some cases where that is happening. And so, the ability to capture these kind of data, which really allowed us to study Seattle, and I'll give them credit for this. The reason I was starting looking at Seattle was because they capture data on parking and they are able to measure occupancy, which a lot of cities aren't. So getting that infrastructure in place now, I think, is really, really helpful so that you can start to measure how these things are impacting your revenue streams in the long term. Of course, in the long term, the change is going to happen, right? And that policy should be leading rather than following that. I think we don't have to look too much farther than the case of Uber and Lyft coming into a city, that being reactive isn't always the most beneficial approach to being able to control what's going on. You see the same thing with Airbnb coming in, and cities being very reactive. We have data now that we can look at some of these relationships and see what's happening and say, okay, hey, what do we want our city to look like? And so trying to take some proactive approaches to lead. We're definitely going to see revenue declining over time if no policy change is made. Now, you could change the rates that you're charging for parking and your revenues won't decline to the same extent, but that may also change behavior of people to say, oh, wow, now parking is $7 an hour instead of $5 an hour, maybe I'll take an Uber instead. But you may want to make that decision to say, hey, that's not necessarily such a bad thing to free up those parking places and get some people into modes of transportation that don't lead to parking, and we can reallocate that use to something more beneficial for more people. And with that topic is that we should use this opportunity to reshape the public rights of way for new or different uses. So if we don't need as much parking, well, what can we do with that space? And reuse it for other things that are going to benefit more people in different ways that we haven't in the past. And there's a lot of different ways you can go with that discussion, but this is sort of just the start of getting that thought into the realm of policymakers. So I guess I'll just finish and add a few things of what we're doing to extend this study. And so what we presented here is sort of the initial phase of looking at some of the primary drivers. But what Ann and I are doing right now is adding in some additional layers of data that we don't show in this particular analysis and aren't included as controls, particularly looking at zoning. and the type of land use that is occurring in each one of these neighborhoods, because that's clearly going to drive people to drive or not drive, or to Uber or not Uber, or to use public transit or not. And so what we know about that so far is, generally speaking, commercial and industrial higher use neighborhoods have a increase in revenue. Not too surprising. Finding there, and that we also look at the number of transit stops that are in each one of those neighborhoods, so the density of public transit. And right now what we're seeing, again, this sort of still in the initial phase, is that each additional transit stop per mile would increase revenue by 4.8%. Now that's pretty substantial. I'm still kind of working that out, so don't quote me on that, even though I'm saying it, but and that there may be a lot of different explanations of that. It's just maybe the places where there's a lot of parking, there also happens to be a lot of public transit access, because that's where people want to go. We're still kind of working on that. We can also look at the role that jobs might be placing in that. So generally speaking, what we're seeing here is that one of those census tracts, those units of observations, that has more jobs per square mile, so higher density of jobs that are existing there, is having a positive impact on revenue. Again, initial results indicating about 0.1% increase for each 1,000 additional jobs. So again, a relationship between that type of use and what's going on in that particular neighborhood. But you should look for more exciting results to come in the coming months as we finish up this second phase of this project, and trying to explore a few more questions beyond just what we've talked about today. So I think that wraps up our presentation, unless Anne has other things she wants to add, that brilliant thoughts that came to you while we were through this.
No, I think we'll keep it short and sweet and look forward to all of your questions.
All right, great. Well, thank you. Great overview in your research. Looking forward to your next steps in your research as well. For those viewing the webinar, please feel free to continue to submit your questions if you have them. It does look like we have a few from the audience already, so we'll go ahead and start with those. So one of the first questions, why would a city be concerned about parking revenue losses? Isn't fee for parking a way to manage on-street parking durations?
Well, so we look across the country, different cities rely more or less on parking revenue. And I think, if my recollection serves me correctly, somewhere between 3 and 4% of most cities' revenue, general fund revenue, can come from parking. Now that may not sound like a lot, but I think in the case of Seattle, it's somewhere like $40-some million a year, right? And that's a big chunk of change. And while Seattle doesn't have a specific policy, at least that is listed publicly, that they're trying to maximize revenue, right? They're trying to maximize the use of that public right of way, following in the the Wrapup model of ideal levels of parking occupancy so that people can get access to it. But revenue still has to be on the minds of people, because if that 3 or 4% of your general fund revenue goes away, well, you still need that money, and you're going to have to raise it somewhere else.
Great. All right, and we've got a comment, and actually somebody from the Seattle Department of Transportation is online, and she just confirmed, and so I'll just read her comment first. It says, yes, in Seattle, paid street revenue is about 39 million. Parking citations and commercial parking tax brings this all up to over 100 million. So that is a significant amount of funding to make up if there were some revenue losses. So thank you for confirming those numbers, Mary Catherine. And then also, she did want to thank you for your webinar, and then also has another comment, and maybe there's a question, or you can potentially expand on this comment, but she mentions that I've been really interested in when and to from where people use TNCs and how that relates or not to parking areas and when we charge for parking. In Seattle, the understanding seems to be that TNC usage is for nightlife, airport, and for some work trips, for instance, the South Lake Union tech jobs. Some of those have paid parking on street components, but others don't.
Yep. Well, first I'll say Mary Catherine is awesome. She has been a wonderful champion of this project and has been a great help sort of navigating through the city. But again, the city itself has this great infrastructure that made this project very easy because they have open data. Cannot stress enough how, as a researcher, how great that is. We haven't really explored the specific question of kind of the origin destination in this yet, but I think that's a great place to go in trying to understand how behaviors are changing, and then what implication that has from a revenue standpoint. Because certainly some of these people coming from the outside of the city or going to places outside of the city, and there may be different implications for those kind of things.
And I'd add to one of the really interesting things I think about this whole project is thinking about essentially the potential substitution of Uber and Lyft for driving and parking. And so, for example, when we've been seeing surveys of ride-hail users, often they'll say one of the biggest motivations for taking a ride-hail trip is because of, say, difficult to find or expensive parking. And so this project was a lot of fun because there's these different hypotheses we went into it with, which is, are people leaving their cars at home and taking Uber and Lyft or transit or biking, et cetera. But would we see, for example, an increase where we're seeing more ride-hail trips, we're seeing falling parking occupancy and revenue, and we're really not, at least at the current levels of TNC trips. And to me, what that suggests is that there's not a finite number of trips serving different neighborhoods. So basically, we're seeing busy, active neighborhoods that have a lot of destinations and activities and opportunities in them are just trip attractants and trip generators. So people are still driving to them, they're still parking, but more people could be potentially accessing these neighborhoods because there's now more modes available to them. So it's not that it's a one-to-one substitution for someone leaves their car behind and instead takes an Uber, but really there's a much more complicated story about overall levels of travel. And that's quite different, I think, from a place like an airport, which again, anecdotal evidence from a select number of airports they seem to be finding that parking revenue is declining. But if you imagine, for example, you have 10,000 people using an airport every day, right? You're not necessarily going to be likely generating more demand for an airport because of Uber and Lyft now being available to get there. So, it's a really different context. So I think it is important to keep in mind the urban context, the origin, destination, et cetera. But the fact that the number of trips does not appear finite, I think, is an important finding, and important to think about people accessing opportunities and traveling throughout cities.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I wonder, because you have the sense, the different parking districts, have you been able to, or maybe characterize the different parking districts with different destinations and analyze the effect of the type of destinations with the parking revenue?
Well, we've thought about that. We've started collecting some of those popular points and things like that, or thought about this from the perspective of, hey, there's, Seafair going on, or Bumbershoot or something, or a Seahawks game or a Mariners game, or, one of these types of big events that you could actually measure the surge of trips going around those things. But I think that's like stage 3 or 4 of this project, just because there are so many questions that are really interesting to try and address. Again, one of the challenges of working with these types of data is that it's really huge and it can be pretty slow. I think it probably took me 6 months or so to finally get the data in a form that was usable. It can take an hour or longer on a supercomputer to open one of these data sets. So it's kind of limiting in the ability to do some of the work that, if it were tiny data, that it would be a lot easier.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think the idea to do an origin destination analysis is certainly a really interesting one, and one for future research. In general, when I've looked at origin destination flows in other cities using TNC data, they're typically, it mirrors often how we would expect other car travel, for example. So people are coming and going from all over. It's not necessarily, people are traveling from only point A to point B. It's really hard to tease out the exact flow patterns and to distinguish them from other car trips. They mirror other car trips pretty closely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure, that makes sense. Great. Looks like we have a question about some of your methodology on obtaining the parking occupancy data for this study and how you calculated that.
All right, so one of our former commenters on there, Mary Catherine from the city of Seattle, helped to direct me to that. But the city itself has collected these data from each one of their parking pay boxes. And so the general methodology behind it is they know how many spaces are paid for, and how many exist within the sphere of that particular pay box. And so their data set was able to calculate, with some level of precision. There's obviously a bit of fuzziness going on in there because people will, not pay for parking, or they have a hang tag that, allows them to not pay for it, or they leave early, or they leave late, or, those types of things. There's some error in it, but the city itself has created that. Now, you go to the project page for the initial phase of this research. There is that data set that can be downloaded from the NITC website. And so if somebody wanted to get that, they can also contact, I think, Mary Catherine. I don't want to speak too much for you there. And they or other folks at SDOT who've been able to help me get a lot of that. They have an API, application program interface feed on the SDOT or the City of Seattle's open data portal that you can write a script and say, give me the data for all the transactions, and you can calculate the occupancy from the transactions as well, because you can see how many transactions, how long somebody paid for, and do the calculation yourself as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it looks like Mary Catherine also replied and said that the SDOT does calculate the paid parking occupancy and post data online, and we can share that. She also shared the link, so we're happy to share that link in the post-webinar email. So do look for that. Great. All right, we have time for more questions. We don't actually have any more in the queue right now, but I had a question actually, and maybe we'll give some time for others to ask questions if they have them. I was curious, the study that you're doing is looking at the on-street parking, and I realize it's probably harder to do with parking garages because of the private nature. Do you think that would be similar to what you're finding with on-street parking, or are you planning on doing any kind of analysis with parking garages in the future?
Well, Seattle's parking garages are all private. And so that created, obviously a challenge in collecting the data. We have, for our next phase, going to include that inventory. So we'll know how many off-street parking spaces, at least in the paid parking realm. If there's a Costco in a neighborhood that has a parking lot, we're not collecting the information on that, where you might not have to pay for that parking space. So we hope to be able to control at least for the amount of that, but we don't have data on the actual utilization. Seattle does have an e-park program that you can go on this website or have an app, and you can look and see how many spaces are available at different parking garages. But that program doesn't include all the parking garages in the city. And it hasn't been active for the full study period we have, and there's some problem with some of the sensors. It's a voluntary program, so you're not going to get a representative sample of parking garages, and they won't, distributed representatively. But I think in the future and potential in other cities that may own and operate some of the garages or other places where some of that data is available, I think those are really good questions to understand if the relationship is similar for off-street parking.
Yeah, and I'll just add that in general, the link between off-street parking and on-street parking, especially when the off-street parking is private, is really tricky and really difficult to tease out. The off-street parking often has some interesting rates, such as early bird specials. They gear themselves sometimes towards commuters specifically, or late night rates. So can be either an hourly or kind of daytime rates. So they're so nuanced often in how they're operated, and rarely when they are private are they coordinated with the city. And so both that has implications for how the city manages parking, but also how people use the different parking supply. So for example, depending on if the price is balanced in the off-street versus on-street spaces, for example, SF Park has done some analysis or some evaluation on this. People may circle blocks to look for on-street parking if they're either not aware of the price of off-street parking, or if the price of off-street parking could in fact be quite a bit higher than the on-street parking. So in general, coordinating the parking supply so that people are aware of, the price is transparent, the occupancy is transparent across the entire supply is certainly one strategy to just better inform travelers.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. A question from the attendees. Have other cities updated their zoning or development code to account for TNCs? And if so, could you share any examples that you're aware of?
I'm not personally aware of any zoning or development code updates. What I'm more aware of is changes to curb management and things like implementing loading zones, and those can either be permanent loading zones that are present for the entire day, or sometimes they're temporally based. So it could be, for example, a normal parking space that, say, in the evening hours, it's switched use over to a loading zone. And so there's examples from Washington, D.C. is a particularly good example of updating the curb use specifically, but that's not necessarily development code or zoning. I think in general, there's a lot of talk about TNCs and how they should be incorporated into changing parking requirements, both off-street and then also thinking about managing the on-street parking. But that is a longer conversation. Zoning is certainly a sticky subject often and slow to change.
Yeah, and I would say, Washington, D.C. as an example that Ann pointed out, they're doing lots of experimentation with different types of things going on. And San Francisco, in the same vein, doing different kind of experiments of, getting some of the TNCs off of the main streets and onto the side streets to reduce the double parking congestion, the risk to passengers getting in and out with the double parking and those kind of things. But again, the zoning and development side, I'm not real sure that I've heard of anything specific on that front.
Great. All right, another question from the audience. In this study, have you considered the impact of shared scooters and bikes, and how would you expect to see a similar effect on demand for car parking?
Yeah, the piece that I've seen related to this, I think relates to Uber, and they've seen some, once they bought Jump, they now had the data available to see, people's modal use between the different things, and they saw some decrease in their car use when those scooters and bikes were available. So I think there's definitely some overlap in the availability of the different modes, and people are willing to shift between them if it's convenient, if it's easy.
But I think they specifically saw a lot of shift when it was raining, for example. So when it rained, people would get off the Jump bikes and they would hop into an Uber or Lyft, or when it was nicer weather, they would then get on a Jump bike because actually it was faster than taking an Uber or Lyft, sort of free themselves from congestion. I think this again gets the question though about, are the number of trips finite, right? And so generally in transportation planning, we always think, how can we provide as many possibilities as possible for travelers to get from point A to point B? Can we give them alternatives to, say, driving alone? And so I think these certainly, require more research to understand the patterns of scooters and bikes on parking, or the potential association between parking and scooter and bike trips. But I think it's an open question. It could be a substitution, it could be a complement. But again, I don't think we would assume that if we see more bike trips, we would see fewer, say, Uber trips or parking, just inherently.
Great. All right, well, and with that, it doesn't look like we have any more questions lined up. I just actually removed Ann and Ben's contact information, but I'm sure we will be sharing those slides, and so And also, if for more information, you can download the research. We will share those links with you. But thank you everyone for joining us today. And thanks again to Ann and Benjamin for sharing their work. You can view other professional development offerings on our website at nitc.track.pdx.edu. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.